El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Donde sobra corazón, ay Carmela, ay.
Well, I'll just get right into it, I guess. My name is John Peterson. I'm the editor of Socialist Appeal. And I'd also like to thank Michael and Kieran for having this open, comradely exchange of ideas on this very important aspect of world history, the history of the working class. I have a personal interest in this subject. My grandfather was from Teruel in Aragon and ended the Civil War period in Valencia and ended up fleeing afterwards and ended up in Mexico, and through a very circuitous route I ended up here. So I have some personal interest in this whole history, but obviously my main interest is political. Above all, why did it fail? Why did the Spanish Revolution fail? Leon Trotsky once said that the Spanish masses could have made 10 revolutions with the amount of energy and sacrifice that they put into it. But why didn't it succeed? In my opinion, the problem was the lack of a far-sighted revolutionary leadership. And that's the short answer. I'll get more into that a little bit later. Now, everybody has their criticisms of this or that group in the revolution. But I think we can all agree that everybody made some mistakes, some very important, some major errors, and in a lot of ways, studying the Spanish Revolution is a study of what not to do in a revolution. But the consequences of defeat, of course, were terrible. We ended up with fascism and dictatorship for decades. Ultimately, World War II was a result of the defeat of the Spanish Revolution, and the failure to learn from those mistakes also led to other things like Chile in 1973. And countless other examples where those kinds of mistakes were made. But the point isn't to point fingers at people. The point is to learn from this experience because it is relevant today, and not just in places like Venezuela, where I think there's really important parallels, but also ultimately for the revolution that we're going to see in this country in the not too distant future. So we need to learn from this accumulated experience of the working class, which we've been accumulating very painfully since at least 1848. And we don't want to repeat these mistakes too many more times. The first thing I think we need to understand is that a revolution is a process. It's not a single act. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's an ebb and flow. It's a process. It's a very complex process. And over the course of the roughly 8 years of the Spanish Revolution, you had periods of reaction, periods of advance, periods of retreat, and of course you had throughout this sort of constant situation of rising dual power and this conflict between the forces in the Republic and then ultimately against the forces of fascism. And in order to understand the Trotskyist position in relation to the Spanish Revolution, I think we first have to understand the character of the revolution. Now, and I think in order to understand the character of the Spanish Revolution, and in order to understand the revolutions that we're seeing, for example, in Latin America today, we have to understand Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, which basically explains that the democratic tasks of the revolution, the tasks that were accomplished, for example, in England or in France hundreds of years ago by the capitalist class, by the bourgeoisie, nowadays they can't be accomplished by the capitalist class because they've come on the scene of history too late. They're too tied to the multinational imperialists. They're too tied to the landlords, and they can't carry out these basic progressive tasks like this, distribution of the land to the peasants and things like that. And therefore, the only force in society that can resolve these tasks is the working class. But even to make those modest reforms, these basic democratic reforms, the workers and the peasants run into the limits of private property, i.e., they run into the limits of capitalism, and they therefore have to surpass the limits of bourgeois democracy, of the capitalist system, and pass on to the socialist tasks, such as nationalizing the banks, taking over the factories under workers' control, and so on. There's no such thing as a progressive bourgeoisie nowadays. I know there's a lot of people, ironically enough, even in this country, think that there's a progressive wing of the capitalist class. But the fact is, the interests of the working class, the vast majority of society, and the interests of the capitalists are 100% opposed, and you can't possibly reconcile them. It's like trying to square the circle. And that's why, in my opinion, and I think the experience of the Spanish Revolution bears out, that only the working class can lead the rest of the oppressed layers of society towards actually resolving the problems that they face. And of course, you can't build socialism in just one country, so the revolution is permanent, going back to Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, in the sense that it can't limit itself to one country, but must go become an international revolution. Now this is as compared to the theory of two stages, the two-stage theory of revolution, which says that first we'll have the sort of democratic revolution, and then we'll worry about at some point in the future about the socialist revolution. Now this kind of a theory where you believe that there is a progressive bourgeoisie, where you believe that you first have to complete this stage and then we'll worry about the next stage, the socialist stage, leads you ultimately to the formations of things like the Popular Front, like we saw in Spain, and like we saw in Chile, and like we've seen in country after country. And the Popular Front, of course, what that means, it sounds nice, maybe on paper, everybody together, but in a Popular Front, by definition, you have capitalists in this government, and also the workers. But since the capitalist system is the dominant system at this stage in time, this means that you're subordinating the interests of the working class to the interests of the capitalists. And this ultimately then paralyzes the working class from being able to act in its own interests. This is a policy that was carried out basically by all the forces in Spain in the 1930s, from the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, the POUM. And ultimately what it means is that since we're in the stage of the democratic revolution, and we have to defend private property, because private property is sacred, private property is the foundation of capitalism. We can't touch that yet because that comes later. We'll worry about that later. But so mistakes in theory will lead to very important mistakes then in practice and have tragic consequences. So then to sum up, the two programs that were being proposed in Spain, the two different options that the Republic had, especially after Franco's uprising, was to preserve capitalist property forms and still try and defeat Franco, or to abolish private property and to conduct a revolutionary war led by the working class in order to smash fascism. Now, unfortunately, the former is what happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. A couple of concrete mistakes of these tactical and strategic mistakes that were made that led to even bigger problems in practice. Now, one of the tasks is in the middle of a revolution, of course, is how do you connect the ideas and program of revolutionary Marxism with the masses? How do you become a mass force? And in order to convert a small group of people, because at the beginning of this process, the Trotskyists in Spain were a very, very small group. In 1930, 1931, they were a very small group, and their task then was how can they connect their ideas, the ideas of Trotsky as against the Communist International, as against Stalinism, how could they convert that into a major force within Spain? And in order to do that, it's important to orient to the traditional organizations of the working class, where the workers are, where they're fighting, even if these organizations might be the leadership of these organizations. As we've seen, the leadership of all these organizations were extremely reformist. They were all in favor of class collaboration, but the rank and file were extremely radicalized and looking for ideas and very willing to make tremendous sacrifices for all of this. So in 1931, Trotsky suggested to the Spanish Trotskyists, who were led by this guy named Andreu Nin, they were part of the International Left Opposition, or Andrés Nin, as he's called in Spanish, suggested that they orient to the Young Socialists. Now, the Young Socialists, again, the Socialist Party of Spain, which is a reformist party, the Young Socialists, it was over 100,000 young people, most of them armed, and they came asking for ideas, asking for theory, asking to get organized, asking to learn about revolutionary Marxism. Now, Nin rejected this, basically on principle, because the Socialist Party were the traitors of World War I, etc., and they wanted nothing to do with it. And what ended up happening was that the Stalinists, the Communist Party, who had a very small base actually in Spain at that time, they did take advantage of that opportunity. They ended up taking over the Young Socialists, that group, and gaining tremendous influence among these tens of thousands of armed young people in a very dynamic situation. So that was a major mistake and a major turning point, and that was as early as 1931. Another mistake, a major mistake, is if you mistake the character of the revolution. What are the tasks of the revolution? Is this a